Bir algı var. Sanki bazı mevzuları birinci dünya ülkeleri konuşabilirmiş. Biz kendi iç meselelerimizi konuşmalıymışız gibi. Yurt dışında konuşulan her şeyi seneler sonra Türkçe'ye çevirip kendi aramızda sonradan konuşmak bizim kaderimiz olmamalı. Hepimizi ilgilendiren global tartışmalara eş zamanlı olarak dahil olmalıyız. Merakımızın ve internetin gücüyle bence eş zamanlılığı yakalayabiliriz. Bugün iklim ya da teknoloji gibi meselelerden bütün dünya etkileniyor. Dolayısıyla bunlar milliyet tanımayan mesele. Böyle konularda bizimle diyalogta bulunmaktan çok memnun olacak bir sürü isim var dünyanın dört bir yanında. Bu isimlerden bir tanesi de Hollanda'dan Tilburg Üniversitesi'nden yardımcı doçent Christiaens.
To what extent are these technologies really able to change our behavior? That's very difficult to measure. This claim of some tech companies to actually change our behavior might be overstated.
What are you most concerned about?
Most concerned. Well, there are lots of concerns, but I say one thing is...
What are you most optimistic about the age that's coming?
I think it can be very useful for...
Christiaens, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me.
Before we start, I would like you to introduce yourself to the audience, for those who are listening or watching.
Yes, so I'm Christiaens. I'm an assistant professor of economic ethics at Tilburg University. Tilburg University is in the Netherlands. We have here a master's program on digital ethics and philosophy of data. So I teach in that master's a course on digitalization and meaningful work. So indeed, most of my research as well concerns the impact of digital technologies on work relations and labor conditions.
Okay, so the main difference between you and me is you actually know what you're talking about. Okay, so I did prepare, as you know, a few questions. Okay, the first one is the obvious imbalance between the resources that are used for the technological development of AI and the imbalance between that and the people who are responsible for the ethical evaluations of these technologies. Do you see an imbalance? And if so, how do you think this can be balanced? Should we slow down the advancement or should we make this discussion even more public?
So indeed, if you look at basically who decides what technologies are made and how they are implemented in the workplace, but also in general, kind of in society, indeed, you see a bit of an imbalance there. Basically, you have a few companies who have enough specifically capital resources to invest in these kinds of technologies. Artificial intelligence requires enormous amounts of data in order to, say, make these software operational. And of course, who can pay for that? Only a few companies can. And even they do that mainly by attracting lots of investors to launch their products, which means that in fact it is a combination of a few tech companies and then financial markets who decide which technologies are made and how they are designed. So indeed, that means that, for instance, you come up with a kind of a bias in workplace relations, for instance, where artificial intelligence is developed mainly to cut on labor costs, because that's what companies are interested in. So they see that they have high labor costs, their employees cost a lot of money. So what if you can automate your tasks? Then you don't need to pay those employees anymore. You need far fewer of them. And instead you can let a machine or let some piece of software do the work, which would be a lot cheaper. So that would be then the plan. But of course, that kind of vision for the future of artificial intelligence, that mainly comes from one specific group of people and their specific interests.
Right.
You notice that as well when you start looking at policy and government regulations. For instance, I did a study with a colleague from Eugenia Stambolia from Vienna University. We did a study of the notion of trustworthy AI in the policies of the European Union, because the European Union sets itself in the market saying that, well, we also invest in AI technologies, just like the US and China are,
right,
but we invest in ethical AI. So we create trustworthy artificial intelligence. So that's kind of their competitive advantage compared to the rest. But once you start looking at what's actually in those documents, you see that notions of trustworthiness or for instance, AI ethics are actually used as an instrument for the economic development of the AI sector in the European Union. And so they want to promote AI industry, and ethics is a means towards that goal, which means that in then documents that are supposed to provide ethics guidelines for AI, ethics actually takes kind of a backseat to industry interests. So it is about promoting or supporting industry interests in developing AI technologies. And the role of the state or of the government is then mostly in managing that direct or for managing that development in an ethical direction. So the front seat, kind of who sits in the cockpit, is industry. So indeed, then you can say, well, ethics or any kind of countervailing powers are, let's say, in a minoritarian position vis-a-vis tech companies. And so indeed, what I usually plead for is for a more conflictual model where then countervailing powers, so forms of resistance or protest or regulation of AI technologies, have far more power to actually block the development of some AI technologies or influence the development of them.
Exactly. That's how I see all of these discussions. We are not opposing these technologies. It's actually a very big contributing factor to talk about these things, the ethical evaluations. As soon as you criticize any revolutionary technology, you're regarded as like someone who's against advancement, but that's actually the opposite. Every new tool or system that we're using has gone through a long process of discussion and evaluation, so it's the healthier way. I do hope that these ethical boundaries don't cause that sort of AI to get behind the unethical type of AIs that maybe China or states are developing. So I hope that doesn't become a disadvantage for the AI race, for it to be more ethical.
That depends on the implementation, right? So if, for instance, US companies develop particular forms of artificial intelligence that then gets implemented by companies, for instance. So you have, for instance, artificial intelligence that's used as hiring algorithms. So if you're a company, you work at HR, you have lots of CVs coming in for a limited amount of jobs. And so the claim is, well, what if we use an artificial intelligence system to screen those CVs? Look for kind of the top candidates such that we don't have to employ human staff to go through all these CVs. In principle, you could say, well, given the amount of CVs that sometimes companies get for particular jobs, might be an interest in that. But what we've noticed are already cases where this AI actually didn't properly work. So for instance, Amazon used this form of this system, and what they noticed was that the AI had taught itself to only look for male candidates. So this was specifically for managerial jobs, and Amazon had trained its AI system with the CVs of previously successful candidates. And given that in the past they had hired lots of men, the system had taught itself to look for men. And so then eventually they had to discard this AI system for the kind of discriminatory effects that it had. And so in these kind of situations, you can imagine, well, if Amazon actually had to develop that system in some form of negotiation with, for instance, trade unions, these kinds of problems might have already been avoided from the start. That's kind of what I mean with these countervailing powers. If you start from a very kind of unilateral vision of what you want to achieve with your AI technology, then you might create all this collateral damage in the process. And it's through forms of social conflict or through these kind of negotiations with people with different interests that these kind of problems might show up in advance.
So now we're looking at this issue as a competition race between like states, the China, and then the European Union. But before we started this, you briefly talked about the global impact of this AI race. So would you like to talk about that again?
If you look at, say, the whole, what they call the value chain of AI systems, by which they mean, well, that an AI system is not localized in one specific place, but is actually spread out over the entire planet. So if we look at something like ChatGPT, of course, there's a company in the United States that owns the software, but ChatGPT as a whole is actually localized in multiple places. So one example is, if you want to develop this form of generative AI, you need to start from a certain level of training data. So you need to feed it data, and then it can start teaching itself how to create text. So then the first question is, where does this data come from, this training data? Well, it has been plucked from the internet, so from all of us. So at these companies, what they do is they look at language that is present on the internet and that is free to use. Well, you use that as a data set to train your system in order to generate sentences of their own. So this training data comes from across the whole globe. And also, once you have your database and your algorithms to decide, say, how to make sentences and texts, then you also need to repair mistakes, for instance. So once your ChatGPT starts hallucinating or these kind of things, you need some kind of maintenance of your database. So there we see that OpenAI outsourced lots of this work to companies or subsidiaries in Kenya. So in Kenya, you had then a couple of companies where then people work in order to repair all kinds of mistakes in ChatGPT. There was a big story about this once that ChatGPT was released, that indeed, if you looked at who actually worked on this or worked for the company was not just marketing people or data scientists in the US, but actually also these, say, low-wage workers in Kenya doing all these forms of maintenance. And then lastly, there is also, once you have your system in place, there's the environmental impact of specifically these data centers. You need a whole lot of computing power in order to fuel AI systems. And so this computing power is localized in data centers across the globe, often in places where not a lot of people live. There they have an enormous ecological footprint. So in terms of waste produced, this is enormous, specifically because you need a lot of energy to fuel all those computers in those data centers. And you also need a lot of energy to cool those computers down. So you create a lot of heat in a data center, but you don't want the computers to go to be set on fire. So you need some kind of cooling system, which means in some cases that whole rivers get displaced in order to use the water from those rivers to cool down the computers. Or for instance, you build data centers in regions where it's very cold, close to the North Pole, for instance, so that the kind of the usual climate of the region already cools down your computers a bit. But so that means that in terms of ecological impact and global warming, using AI systems is quite a considerable carbon footprint, which you don't notice while we use it. So once you use the system on your computer, you don't have the feeling that with every prompt that you type, you're actually having a significant impact on the global environment with that. But in fact, you are.
Well, maybe this is why all these tech CEOs in the last couple of months, they're talking about the nuclear energy once again, like bringing it back. Now, I'm not really informed about the technical aspects of this, but I think at some point they realized that in order to make even better AI, this is parallel to what you're talking about, in order to make it better, they just need to make it bigger with more chips and like bigger servers and more energy. And so I think we're going to see even weirder stuff in the next 5 or 10 years in terms of how big these things will get.
Two things here. One, you're right. Basically, these systems get better the more data you have. And so the more information you have, the more correlations you can look for. And so the better these systems start performing. So you need to enlarge your database. And they call this network effect. And the larger the network, the more effective the system. This counts for artificial intelligence, but also for other digital technologies, by the way. So if you look at social media becomes more valuable the more people are on there. Also from a consumer perspective, why are we on particular social media? Well, because all our friends are. So you need kind of critical mass in order to make this valuable for consumers, but also for companies. The more people are on Facebook, the better it is for Meta, because the more data they have.
Yes, absolutely. There was this speech in 2020. Yuval Noah Harari gave a speech in the World Economic Forum, and he talked about relevancy. This is how they catch you. You want to stay relevant, right? So the reason I started TikTok in the first place was like, I need to reach more people. And you know, how do you do that? If you want to make your music heard, make your message heard, you need to stay relevant. And so now, for example, in Turkey, everyone is trying their best to become relevant, and the biggest way to do that is to get into the digital realm. And so you see like people who make soup film videos, and so because as you said, they want to be in that digital area where everyone else is. And a rejection of all of these data sucking platforms, price for that is to be irrelevant, which affects you in all ways, in social ways, in economic ways. What Harari says, which is actually very terrifying, you need to be willing to be exploited if you don't want to be irrelevant.
No, but there's a point to that. So you can see in lots of sectors that basically one of the main problems or challenges is a scarcity of attention. That counts for, say, on social media, for instance. So you want to stay relevant, meaning you want to grab people's attention. If you don't have a social media presence or these kind of things, it's hard to get people's attention. Same counts for academics, for instance. We publish papers all the time, but how to make sure that people actually read them? For that, you also need to self-promote.
Yeah.
And the classical ways for doing that was things like going to conferences. And so there you meet people in your field. And so once you meet someone, then you establish some form of social relationship. And then once you publish a paper and other people see it, they will read it. And now we've also in academia moved to a kind of a next stage where you promote your work, well, through social media, for instance.
Doing this. Sorry.
Doing this. Exactly. Yeah. So because you want to get people's attention, also why lots of academics are on Twitter or I should say X is exactly for that reason. Because publishing a paper itself is not enough. If you want to make sure that people read it, because there are lots of papers around, you want to keep on top of all the literature, even in your own very specific niche field, it's simply impossible to do that. There's simply too many papers being published. So you have to then scale it down, like which papers are you actually going to read? And that's determined partly by very analog, non-digital criteria. Stuff like, do you know the one who wrote the paper? Have you met them at a conference, for instance? At what university do they work? So if you see that something was published by someone who works at Oxford University, then chances that you will read it will probably be higher than if it's from, let's say, Tilburg University.
No, I love Tilburg University.
So, so indeed, the problem is scarcity of attention. Simply too much material to go through. And so social media, for instance, are used as a tactic to get people's attention. By the way, and then I'll close off for a moment, but which also has some good aspects to it. Where previously, in order to get noticed, you had to work in one of these fancy Ivy League universities. Now, for instance, social media gives an opportunity to scholars who otherwise would never find an audience to actually have a chance at success. So it's not all negative. You
I
give
definitely think so.
opportunities to people who otherwise would have not received the same amount of attention.
I think we are now moving to a new era where institutions have less credibility. This includes like prestigious universities. I think people are, as you said, more focused on what you're saying instead of where you're coming from. Even sometimes you being from Oxford University may even be a negative for some people. So now it's pretty much credible to be like, hey, listen, I'm not here as a representative of a school or like an institution. I am here as my own. I am being sincere and I'm sharing information. So this is now very credible and people actually like it a lot.
Yeah, because indeed what you see is that basically, specifically what social media platforms do is basically they turn human communication into an economic market where you have supply of posts and videos and then there's demand from consumers. So people who watch those videos or who comment on people's posts, who like and subscribe, these kind of things. So you set this platform up as a market, which also means that to get success as someone who makes content or someone who gives information, your institution doesn't matter that much, but whether you supply something for which there is demand. And hence why you see specifically these very polarized political debates online, that very often you see people catering to a particular demand. If there is a demand for right-wing pundits, well, then you have people stepping in to deliver exactly that. And they will get lots of likes and lots of subscribes for doing so. So that's indeed kind of a downside of it, that say you don't get judged on, say, the quality of your thinking, but rather whether or not you are responding to a demand.
I agree with this. The positive perspective that I'm looking at this from is there are not enough nuanced and calm people who are also interesting. So that's an area that you can go in. We have enough dancing people. We have enough crazy people. We have enough polarized people. We have enough angry yelling people. We don't have enough interesting and nuanced and neutral people. If you want to do a career about it, you can, because you don't have a lot of competition. And I do believe that a lot of the audience is kind of sick and tired of these polarized discussions. I do believe that the majority of people are like relatively moderate. They're not extreme.
We get back to my remark from earlier.
Okay.
Then we get into questions like who decides how social media platforms are designed. So for instance, what you notice on Facebook or Twitter or some of these other platforms is that the kinds of messages that get promoted are the ones that get lots of likes and that gets lots of what they call engagement. What you see is how do you engage people is by speaking to them emotionally rather than intellectually. And so indeed people might agree more with the intellectual discourse, but they will respond to the emotional, affective, kind of visceral communication, both negatively and positively. So then it becomes a matter of, well, the social media algorithm, which kind of messaging does it support or not? And so given that social media companies make their money from data, from gathering lots of data, and they acquire data by having people online very often, providing lots of engagement, because every time you click on something, that is engagement. That's an information that they can gather about you. So they're going to promote exactly that. So then we get again into the question of who decides how a social media platform works. Right now, it's companies who want to pursue a profit. And from their perspective, completely understandable that they want to do that. But what we want as citizens, for instance, might be something else. We want a qualitative intellectual discussion about political topics, but that might not square very well with the profit incentive of these companies.
We have these systems like democracy that did not predict technology. Now we have people who have a lot of power or on societies, not just in their own countries, but in all around the world. And these people aren't even elected, right? But they have more power than, some of the presidents. So it's a very different era. All of these apps are developed not only by great engineers, but also by psychologists or sociologists, probably detect your weaknesses and get you into the loop. With every new technology, as you know, there are these new powers that we obtain. Even with this AI, we can do a lot of tasks that required more time in the past. So now in a lot of ways, we're a lot more powerful than we were in 20 years ago. We have some new technologies that are coming on, like virtual reality, even more advanced AI, or like Neuralink. So now, how do you think the power dynamics will continue? Will we as citizens be more powerful, or will governments or big tech corporations be even more powerful?
So maybe good to mention here. So my original background is in one particular philosopher, Michel Foucault.
Uh-oh. Yeah.
So his main topic was indeed the study of power and power relations. And the reason why he talks about power relations is because power is never a matter of kind of a resource that one person has at the expense of someone else. We often think about power in this way, as if one person or company or institution has the power, then there is another agent who lacks that power. And so by framing power as a relationship, you show more that this can shift and turn a lot. What looks like one agent exercising power over another might actually also be a weakness or something that very easily triggers resistance from another group. And so you see that, for instance, the implementation of some of these new technologies. Some of them fail miserably. So even if you have lots of money or lots of, power invested in launching a particular product, that doesn't necessarily mean that it will automatically succeed. There might be lots of resistance against this. And so it's always a kind of a struggle to see whether our technology succeeds or not. To give a case, do we remember the thing this was 2-3 years ago that Facebook or Meta was going to launch the metaverse?
Yeah.
Whatever happened to that?
I don't know. Yeah, exactly. Yes. People were trying to buy land from metaverse.
So metaverse was an experiment that failed. There was another example of Google launching Google Glasses, which were glasses that you could use to take pictures and that would report information on your glasses. But there as well, people found this very creepy, mostly. And so nobody wanted this. So you also quite often see that some of these technologies fail because there isn't really an uptake. And so, for instance, I think Neuralink might be one of those kinds of technologies. Once you start talking to people whether they want to have chips implanted in their brains, usually people are quite hesitant to do this. So it's only a very small niche of people who are enthusiastic about this, but most people don't want this. Quite a lot of these technologies fall flat.
I mean, one example that I can think of is in 2020, COVID happened. Until that point, everyone was very confident that we were going through a very rapid phase of digitalization. And when COVID happened with the lockdowns, etc., all these digital fields were shown as a great option or alternative to, live life or communicate. But I think every person was like, no, I want reality. I don't want this. This is making me sick. Looking at screens is making me sick. I don't want to play games. I want to go out and connect. So I think that showed us that we are still very far away from being fully digitalized.
Yeah, because even there, where indeed you could say you had a kind of crash diet of digital technologies, that even now we have learned some things and we use some of it. So for instance, the fact that we have this meeting now online is, I think, a sign of that we've also learned certain digital skills and that sometimes this can be very useful. I think almost everyone will agree that they don't want to do their job entirely online as they did during COVID. So once in a while, an online meeting, that's okay. But having all your meetings online, or that's usually more difficult.
I agree. We're, I think, a generation of balance. Let's go to another question. When I heard this, I was actually quite terrified about it. There was this book released in 2021 with Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO, and the very famous American politician.
Henry Kissinger.
Yes, their work. Yes. So as you know, then, of Of course, the way they talk about AI was terrifying. They said that eventually we will become so dependent on AI that we won't be able to function intellectually on our own because we will get so used to asking all the questions to an extremely advanced AI. Now, first of all, I want to get your opinion on that. As an alternative to this, I thought about like the fitness industry. Now we don't need to do physical tasks, but we still want to be physically strong for various reasons. It's more healthy to be so. You feel more safe against any possible like physical threats. And it's also more attractive for a lot of people. In a world where a lot of intellectual tasks are done by AI, do you think that just as we do fitness right now, we will focus on keeping our intellectual capabilities active?
Two things. First of all, about this no specific kind of cognitive dependency on technologies. To some extent, that is true. We've seen it also with other technologies already. So, for instance, there's research about this Google Maps, and the more people rely on Google Maps, the more difficult they find it to navigate themselves without using their smartphone. So, if you would ask people like 50 years ago, didn't have smartphones and these kind of things, to navigate their way around the city, they would have been far more skilled in doing this than people who often use Google Maps for this nowadays. And because indeed we've kind of outsourced part of our skills to the smartphone. So navigational skills have indeed been lost. And so the fear is that when it comes to reasoning and argumentation, that for instance, generative AI like ChatGPT will kind of take over our capacities for reasoning. To some extent, that is indeed a problem. Whether we will actually let it come that far, that's another matter. For instance, at universities, we have lots of debates and discussions about to what extent students can use ChatGPT. And you do notice that if students actually want to write a paper that passes, so that gets a good grade, that's solely relying on ChatGPT or some of the other technologies simply doesn't work. The software is not good enough for that. So different than to Google Maps. Google Maps is very performative in getting you to wherever you want to go.
Yeah.
Also there are sometimes problems, but usually if you live in the global north in a large city or so, Google Maps functions optimally, no problems. With generative AI, that is not really the case. If you rely entirely on ChatGPT to write your student papers, you will not get very high grades with that. Hence why I don't think that the analogy then with fitness, for instance, that entirely works, because the reasoning and argumentation cannot simply become kind of a luxury good in the same way as physical strength can.
Well, the question is based on an assumption that the AI will continue to advance, maybe at this rate.
So the question is whether that will actually happen. You can also predict the reverse, as in, like I told you, so this generative AI systems, they keep training themselves on the basis of our conversations with ChatGPT, for instance. And the more then that it hallucinates or comes up with rubbish answers, this is also new input on which it trains itself, which means that there's also risk of AI getting worse over time. Because if it keeps feeding itself bad data, then it will start delivering worse responses. And then these worse responses become new input data, and then the response get even worse. And so it's not a given that these AI systems will automatically get better. The reverse might also happen. I'm a bit hesitant to predict that these AI systems in the near future will really be able to replace our basic cognitive skills.
The nature of any technology, I think, but maybe specifically AI, prevents you from making any long-term predictions, not even short-term predictions. I don't know how ChatGPT 6 will be, maybe next year, right? Yeah, talking about not being able to predict what's going to happen. What are some very popular, maybe cliche at this point, or like tiring predictions that you think are wrong? For example, everyone thought that AI will take over physical jobs first, and then it will come to intellectually demanding jobs. The opposite is happening, right? It's really good at making art. Unfortunately, as a musician, it's really good at composing or like making music. So now that prediction was widely accepted, and now it turned out to be wrong. Is there anything that you think people are too sure about or maybe wrong about?
I'd say that the main thing would be that the course of technology and technological development is kind of inevitable. So often it's kind of claimed that, well, but these technologies are coming anyway. So we simply need to accept them and kind of work or learn to live with them. And I don't think that is true. That is not set in stone. Because again, the way in which technologies are designed and how they are exactly implemented for what they are used depends a lot on who gets a say about these matters. If it's only big tech companies who decide how these systems work, then indeed they're going to serve their interests. Whereas if you come up with other decision-making systems, you might have very different technologies. To give a very concrete case for this comes from, I told you I mainly work on digitalization of work. I have a particular platform called Amazon Mechanical Turk. So it's a branch of Amazon, not the retail platform where you usually kind of go to order your books or something like that. You have another platform for all forms of click work. So for instance, if you want to have lots of pictures labeled because you want to make a facial recognition software, for instance, who labels all those first pictures? Or for instance, if you're a psychologist and you want to have lots of surveys answered, but you don't want to keep asking your students to fill in the survey, you can put these on Amazon Mechanical Turk, and then you have thousands of people who click on your survey, they do the survey, and send it back. And you pay them then a small amount of money for them for these tasks. One of the big problems with that platform was that clients could review workers, but not the other way around. So if I, as a client, let's say I'm a psychologist, I put my survey on there and I get the responses back, then I can give them a rating, well, how good of a job this worker did. And if I say that this was a terrible job, then I can even refuse to pay them, which of course means that I can then get their finished product, and yet I don't have to pay for them. So creates lots of problems of exploitation. So what happened is that workers then organized together with data scientists, and they developed their own tool called Turkopticon to review and rate their customers. So now if you work on Amazon Mechanical Turk and you install this add-on, now you can actually see the rating of these clients. And so if you have then these exploitative clients, well, then that will show up on Turkopticon. So meaning that here you see kind of a case where technological development is not only a matter of, in this case, Amazon designing a platform in its own interests, but actually workers and activist data scientists can develop kind of counter technology. So the idea that technological development is solely the kind of monopoly of big tech companies, that's simply not true.
Yeah, I've always been pretty pessimistic about this because I've thought that those who develop technologies with ethical concerns would always be left behind, while those who don't take those things into considerations would always move faster and eliminate their competition. But now in this conversation, maybe for the first time, I'm considering having more ethical alternatives is also a great way for competition. Not just having the best functioning model, but having a more ethical or preferable model is actually a great and sometimes better alternative. And the things that you can rate people for today is like crazy. For example, like today, you can rate someone for how fast they delivered a bag of chips. Like you can actually hurt that person's job because your chips came 15 minutes late. So like these systems are, in my opinion, pretty inhumane. Well, would you like to briefly touch on the surveillance aspect of digitalization? Are big tech being honest about it? What about the dangers of it? Because whenever I talk about surveillance, everyone watching is like, so what? So what? Like they're gathering my data. So what? People don't care. If I asked you what's wrong with that, what would you say?
So say first as a kind of an explanation.
Sure.
So how come that people say, so what? I think that has mostly to do with they don't really experience the effects of surveillance on a day-to-day basis. So yes, Facebook keeps track of all kinds of data about me. And every time I get these messages, whether I accept the cookies that this website uses or not, I usually click accept cookies. So why? Because you don't really notice the impact of that, or at least it doesn't really have that much of a negative impact on your lives. In cases where that does happen, then people get more conscious about this. So for instance, in platform work with these ratings and reviews and so, then these become forms of surveillance that people actually pay attention to. So if as a delivery driver, you know that you're going to get a rating and that the company keeps track of that, well, then you are going to have some concerns about this. To a large extent, I think the reason why people don't mind all that much is because they don't really experience in their day-to-day lives a negative effect of that. So I think that kind of explains part of it, but that doesn't mean that say in the long term that there might be negative effects, because the problem is that while companies gather all this data and only later on will they figure out what to use it for. And basically what you do is you have a couple of, actually this is a job description if you're a data analyst at some of these companies. What you do is you start looking in these databases, but whether you can find interesting correlations. Can we find correlations in these data which we can then make predictions on? And so what companies then often want is data from lots of very different sources and then simply smash them together and see what kind of connections show up. This isn't necessarily always to our disadvantage. So I'm thinking, for instance, you have banks who then look at transaction data from their customers to see whether they can come up with new consumer profiles and to see what's kind of the best product or financial product for these individuals. Would they want to save more money, or have they particular spending patterns? So this isn't necessarily bad for us, but of course it can be. Again, the question is primarily who decides what to do with this data. So surveillance isn't always in itself good or bad, but it's what you do with the information that you get from this surveillance that matters.
For the examples that you give, they're obviously, I think, convenient, not even negative. But I read this in a book of Douglas Rushkoff. He was talking about it in his book, Team Human. The algorithm is trying to predict you, and in order to predict you, it tries to change you. It tries to make you more polarized and radicalized, as the examples that you give in the beginning of this discussion. So when it comes to that, when it comes to the systems using all of that data to change you into something, now that's the concerning part for me.
Yeah, so that is a part where the research is not yet very conclusive about this. As in, to what extent are these technologies really able to change our behavior? That's very difficult to measure. There are quite a lot of cases where we've noticed that that's actually, it is in these companies' interests to magnify the claim that they can change our behavior.
Why?
Because again, so for instance, Meta, its money is coming from advertisers. So people want to advertise on the Facebook platform. They pay for advertisement space with then the claim that Facebook will target those advertisements to specifically people whose behavior they can then influence so that you will buy that product. Research on whether these platforms were actually able to change people's behavior is quite mixed. So for instance, Yahoo once did a research project on this where first they paid for advertisement space on social media and then looked at how many people come to their website, and then they stopped for a while, and actually the amount of people going to their website was unchanged.
Yeah.
So, which seems to suggest that this claim of some tech companies to actually change our behavior might be overstated. So to what extent these techniques actually work is still up for debate. There are other cases where we have noticed this to work. So there was a case of Facebook trying to promote people to go out to vote, basically showing lots of pictures of other people who went to vote. And then indeed you see the chances that people seeing their peers who have voted, that then the chance that they will also go out voting, that increased. But so there are cases where indeed platform technologies were able to change our behaviors, but others where this might be overstated. So this kind of Zuboff kind of claim that we risk this kind of dystopian future where computers have completely taken over our minds or something like that, I don't really fear for that. I don't think that that's actually a realistic prospect.
I mean, as you said, the success about how much they can alter our way of thinking, obviously not clear, but there are also trillion-dollar companies that invest hugely on learning how our brains work. So I do believe that at some point they are probably being pretty successful at it as well. 2 questions, we will end it on the positive. Considering all of these things and considering that you are very involved in digitalization, the ethics of AI and all of these things, what are you most concerned about?
Most concerned. Maybe one thing, well, there are lots of concerns, but I'd say one thing is maybe not so much the actual performance of, for instance, generative AI and things like ChatGPT, but rather our belief in its performance. In another French philosopher, Jacques Lacan, you have the idea of the subject supposed to know. He does it in a psychological context where he claims, well, patients often go to their psychiatrist or their psychologist or their psychoanalyst thinking that the psychoanalyst will be able to figure them out because that's the subject supposed to know. That is the individual who has the knowledge to understand my personal troubles or personal problems. And then it often turns out that this is also a very messed up individual who just doesn't know how to. So they overestimate the knowledge or the capacity of this psychologist. And there might be something similar happening with things like ChatGPT. People who use it overestimate its capacities. So for instance, I've had students confessing to me that when they're studying for their exams and they don't know the answer to a particular question, then they ask ChatGPT. And often the software comes up with a wrong answer.
Sure. Yeah.
But then they start studying this because they suppose that ChatGPT is the subject supposed to know. ChatGPT will know. So I'm just going to ask that I'm going to outsource my responsibility to figure out whether something is true or not to that system. And that all very often fails. So let's say overconfidence in these kind of systems might be a big issue.
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, when we're thinking about the cases that I've used about hiring algorithms and these kind of things, once people start thinking, well, but the AI system will know best, and they start to rely on it or be too confident about its performance, then you can start making the wrong decisions.
Yeah, even if they were great at answering questions, I would still be hesitant to rely on them fully, because then there is the issue of honesty. As you said, who is in charge of these systems? Are they providing objective information, or are they providing information that is, parallel to the vision of the company? Because we have many examples of like language models lying, like intentionally lying about something.
Question is whether you can call that lying, because indeed, to what extent can such a system have the intention to deceive?
Sure. Just providing wrong information.
Indeed, giving deceptive information, definitely.
Better way to put it. Yeah, sure.
But indeed, whether that is lying or not will very much depend on whether you attribute intention to it.
Right. Again, overestimating the power of AI. To finish off in a positive point, what are you most optimistic about? Some people are like, AI will create an age of abundance maybe, or like these new tools will save us time so that we can focus on things that we're more passionate about. So what are you most optimistic about the age that's coming?
Let's say, I think it can be very useful for particular, let's say, very specific or narrow repetitive tasks, or for instance, for kind of exploratory research, for instance, like the case of the bank that I gave, where indeed you have these enormous amounts of information, where indeed a human being cannot go through all that information. And then it's helpful to have a system that can try stuff out as a kind of experimental or exploratory search for whether you can find something interesting there. If you have all the data about people's banking transactions, maybe indeed some kind of information can show up, or some interesting nuggets of information. Or for instance, using ChatGPT for stuff like brushing up your language of your paper or something like that. You've written your paper, but you want to have some kind of spell check or like a grammar check on it. This can be pretty useful. So, in those cases, what you notice is that AI then takes kind of a backseat to still human work. So the human performs the work, but uses AI then as one of its tools in a toolbox to do a better job. And so in these kind of situations, you can see that this actually works.
Okay, cool, great. Well, thank you. We did touch on a lot of things, so thank you so much once again for doing this. This is exactly what I wanted, very nuanced and informative content. Is there anything that you want to say about yourself? Any book or any socials?
So if you want to know more about platform work and how so people working at companies like Uber or Deliveroo, and if you want to know how that works, so I recently wrote a book about that called Digital Working Lives, which is about working conditions in platform work and also how to enhance human autonomy in these forms of work.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.